Welcome to the Perfect Place to Put a Practice podcast by Scott McDonald and DrDemographics.com, the best source of demographic, psychographic, and marketing information for professionals.
Hello, this is Scott McDonald, and welcome to Doctor's Demographics podcast. Now, I've gotten in some conversations this week with some of my listeners, and they have been very thoughtful and interesting. Demographics is constantly on the move, and politics leads it, and the economy is important, and the differences between locations is really being fascinating. So I'm going to call this winners and losers of population. Now, I've already talked to you about places that are growing and have promise and potential, and those that don't. But I don't know if I've quite talked to you about the science of how this is all determined and what the important statistics might be. So those of you who are regular listeners, I hope you enjoy this. I think you'll find it interesting. And for those of you who are not regular listeners or viewers, this is a chance to kind of start with some interesting beginning subject things. For more advanced people, I think you'll find this interesting as well, because you may not have heard all this before. So let me go ahead and share my screen and get right into this. So this is how we determine whether a location is a winner or a loser, especially given the new economy, inflation, I think a coming recession, and what you really need to know. Now, first of all, let me start out with a question. Is it a good idea to consider purchasing a practice? And I'd say, oh, yeah, definitely. If you can purchase a practice, go for it. But I'm also noting two things that are kind of going against you, and this is cyclical. One of the things we found is that some locations just aren't available. I'd like to say a lot more practices are for sale, but there are practices for sale that are extremely expensive, and undertaking someone else's lease is risky at this time. So some of you are having to face the fact that you've got to find a location that does not have a practice in it, but that has the potential that once established will be valuable to you. And in inflation, you got to make sure that you've got a slam dunk location, because otherwise the risks of losing all of your investment is very high. So I want to say we're going to try to overcome that as best we can. Some locations that were not losers before are turning out to be losers now. In fact, a lot of things have been flipped on their head as to what locations are going to be good. So let me go into this. Oh, I should say at the beginning, there are some charts. So if you're listening to this, I'll try to describe the data that is in the charts, so you won't have to rely upon a video version of this. We do offer this in an audio format, just in case you know. So let me go and start winners and losers. Now, last week I postulated that the locations that will have the longest lasting success and will have the longest lasting failure are indicated by growth data. Now, some people are saying, oh no, it's income data that is the most important. I want to have a place that's going to have lots of patients, and that I'm going to be able to charge a lot for those patients. That's what I want. Look, I understand the impulse. I'm just not saying that there are as many places for you to consider doing that. So, who is winning and who is losing? What communities, what states, what cities are winning and losing? This is kind of updated. It's actually been updated in the last 2 months from the U.S. Census Bureau. And sometimes they require a little nuancing to really get it. One of my listeners, who I just like, that he's so smart, he's a professor of orthodontics, as a matter of fact, and I won't embarrass him with his name, but he tracks other polls about who is saying what about locations. And he says, you almost have it right based upon some statistics, but in fact, they're going to vary. So what they consider important may not be important, in my opinion, for what you need to know. So what are the locations that are winning and losing? I'm going to rely upon an article by Wendell Cox, a demographer for New Geography. The guy is just brilliant, and he and well, I won't go into all of the guys I follow, but they're pretty smart, and they're working demographers. They often have contracts by governments and government agencies, and they're good. The data comes from the U.S. Census Bureau. Now, here is a statistic, and it comes out of the magazine New Geography. I'll be honest, the data itself, they formatted, but the data comes from the U.S. Census Bureau and looks at the year 1900 to 2021. And I think what you're going to notice is some rather significant tailing off of the U.S. population since really it's about 2000. And it's sobering, okay? Now, as you'll note as we go through this, data usually isn't as dramatic as it is now. But we've had certain events that have primarily been inspired by the economy, and often that's because of government policy, that could give you a heart attack. Now, as a quick aside, the winning populations, those that are gaining population, are usually have a younger median age. So there's a correlation between if they're gaining population and the age of the population. Yes, I recognize that it's nice to have a wealthy population. But in reality, if you're thinking about a location that is going to grow and have long-term success, you've got to look for age of the population. Now, the cost of living may be the cause of why a location is considered a winner rather than it just being an artifact. Lower taxes, and this is the other factor, affordable housing, mean healthcare practices may not earn as much money as from an individual patient. Now, a couple of quick things. We know that there's a correlation between older people and money. Older people don't have kids, they're not having kids, they don't give birth. And really, locations that are older, people who are immigrant populations, and I'm talking about moving from one state to another or from another country, there's definitely a correlation with people who are younger. These situations have specific locations that work well. So I'm tracking all the time the locations that I think are going to work out best for you. So let's take a little snapshot of what is going on today in the population. The United States is growing, which I'm going to point out major countries like Russia and China aren't. And I'm talking about Asian countries and European nations just are not increasing, and they're not increasing much. And the United States is still positive, but it's only growing at 0.12% per year. Metropolitan areas, and that is if we look at cities, major cities in the United States, they're growing at about a negative 0.14%. So most of the big cities, demographers are saying, don't move to the cities, move to the suburbs and move to the more rural locations, those that have a smaller population density. Metropolitan core cities are really taking it in the shorts. Negative 1.25% growth. Now, what I'm saying by that is, if you look at the major places like Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, if you look at the big cities like Washington, D.C., you're going to be disappointed because they're losing population, and not just a little. You may not consider this, a lot of people, but when you have a negative 1.2% growth per year, that's a lot. And I'll talk about specifics on that. Now, suburbs, you got a population increase. Now, most of that is what they call natural increase. It means kids have babies, or people have kids, or whatever. You got a population of about 0.25%, and that's natural growth. There are some centers where the population is increasing because of birth, but remember, the highest birth rates are found among immigrants to the United States. Outside the metropolitan cores, these big city centers, They're growing at about 0.46%, which is not much. In fact, in the past several years, it's looking pretty pathetic. People are not moving to the cores, but they're definitely on the outside. That's where there's any growth at all. Now, I want to talk about who's winning and who's not. So, let's get down to it. If you say, where do you want to go? Well, San Antonio is growing at about 1% per year. Now, San Antonio has a significant Hispanic population, but it's got a lot of Asian people moving into it too. I think it's interesting. Most people don't know that Texas has been really a sponge for Asian populations moving here. We've always expected that in the Northwest, the Seattles, the Portlands. But if you look at it, where are they really heading? Well, San Antonio is the winner. Phoenix dropped and then is coming back. And Phoenix, by the way, we mean Phoenix Metro. That would include Mesa, Phoenix itself. The cities associated with Phoenix Metro, that would be mainly in Maricopa County. Pima County, not so much, but it's still growing too. Now, Tampa, Florida, everybody has talked about, and it's growing at about 0.8% per year. Now, that people don't get really excited by that, but look, I'm going to tell you, that's a lot of people. Let me go back. I think Oklahoma City is growing also surprisingly well at 0.73%. Las Vegas slumped and its economy has come back. A lot of that is because of affordable housing Las Vegas offers. Orlando, Florida, also because of the significant amount of work, quality of life, warm weather. A lot of older people have come from the Northeast and have set up in Orlando, but all of Florida is doing well. Orlando just leads the way. Salt Lake City, as you can guess, is also growing because so many people are finding it possible to live there because the cost of living, low crime, other things. But remember, Salt Lake City is not just Salt Lake City. That includes Provo and Orem on the south side, and in fact, most of northern Utah. But it's growing at about 0.45%. I'm not going to say it's a slam dunk for every kind of practice, because it's not. Housing is not as uber cheap as everybody thought either. But once there, people are very happy and unlikely to move. That's an important statistic. Now, Jacksonville, Florida, also surprised. By the way, it's growing at about the same rate as Salt Lake City, and its growth is at 0.44%. But Jacksonville, because it's drawn people from the northeast, New York, New Jersey areas, has done well in retaining the value of the homes that people have purchased. And it looks like Florida wants to grow. Now, Fresno, California is new on the list. A lot of people have thought California can't make it there, but Fresno is in the heart of the Central Valley. We had a lot of immigrant population that are working the fields in Fresno. It's not a big business center, but agriculturally, it still surprises people with how well it is doing. So it's kind of come back on the list. If you look at Raleigh, North Carolina, once again, not too bad at 0.36% growth. Now, that's not spectacular, but it's solid, and that's what everybody wants to have. Now, who's the losing population here? Well, look, if you look at those statistics that I showed you, they're not growing as much as people who or cities that are losing population are losing. So when we do the locations with a kiss of death, it's really a warning that some locations are not going to be good for you to consider. San Francisco Bay Area, and that's not just the city of San Francisco, it includes the peninsula and across the bay in Alameda County. The rate of loss is so profound that that I got to mention as a special category. It's lost 6.30% in a year. And that's frightening. Now, granted, Marin County isn't losing as much, but then again, it's very, very expensive. The price of entry into Marin County and San Rafael, it's scary. So the next biggest loser is New York City, the 5 boroughs plus Long Island, with minus 3.48%. So you're taking a higher risk in New York City than ever before. Washington, D.C. was supposed to be bulletproof because the federal government's there, and everybody thought, oh, this is going to be fantastic. Except we have found a lot of people are leaving their jobs in Washington, D.C. because their growth is being restricted artificially. So it's losing 2.90%. But if you look at Maryland and Virginia in the DC metro area, that's where it's really losing. Not in the extreme north, not in the extreme south, but right around the capital. Boston is surprisingly losing population, and people didn't think that was going to happen either. It's lost 2.89% in the last year. Part of the problem is environmental. Its cost of housing is very high. The reason that Boston did well is there were lots and lots of jobs, and lots of young people wanted to settle there, but Boston is losing its panache for that. San Jose pays great in its jobs, but the price of housing is, well, more than $1 million for a very small place. And most people, when they get there, get sticker shock and say, forget it, I don't want to be here. So they've lost 2.71%. St. Louis, again, surprising me because the Midwest was supposed to do well, is now the bloom is off the rose a little for St. Louis. I still have hope for the Midwest, what they call the empty quarter. But St. Louis is losing 2.40%. But crime is part of the story. And St. Louis hasn't done much to try to make a middle class or an upper middle class want to move there. Portland, Oregon is losing 1.72%, which is significant. But the biggest loser has been Chicagoland. Now, Chicago is losing 1.65% per year. Obviously, the riots, the crime, the very liberal city and county politics that's going on. Mayor Lightfoot has done nothing to attract anybody, and she seems to be whistling by the graveyard. But if you look at the number of people versus the percent of people, Chicago looks like it's reasonably close to Portland, but it's losing a lot of people. New Orleans losing 1.65% per year, and then Philadelphia kind of rounds out the bottom 5 or 10 of this group. So Philadelphia is not doing well. Unfortunately, some people are predicting Philadelphia is going to have a terrible summer. Terrible. I won't go into why. I'm just going to say I think they're probably right, and Detroit is right up there with it. So you guys, I know you may find inexpensive practices for sale in these areas. I'd be very cautious. Now, what is often underappreciated is how large the numbers are in terms of population. Now, San Francisco, just San Francisco, lost 55,000 people. That is all the growth since 2011. San Francisco was hiring incredibly well. It was paying people tons of money. But I got to tell you, if you're at 450 Sutter, you got to think twice. And that goes for the entire Bay Area, including Oakland. And I'd just be cautious. New York lost 305,000 people this year. That's more than Pittsburgh, St. Louis, and even Salt Lake City. There's just not going to be any great things in New York. I sort of thought with the change of the mayoral administration, it was going to make a change, but apparently it is not. The mayor of New York has sort of said, I don't care, leave. Washington, as I said, lost, this is Washington, D.C. itself, which is really not a big area, lost 21,000 people, which means the cost of housing, well, is going to be very high, and you're going to be lucky to find a place you like that is close into DC. As I mentioned, Chicago fell 45,000, and it has dropped, in other words, to 2,697,000. That wasn't the pattern the demographers had set up for the Midwest, in particular for Chicago. Now think of the loss in two areas: tax revenue and votes. Now in the tax revenue area, it just means that there's not as much money to do big projects and to fix things up and to give free money away. This idea of not prosecuting criminals has not been a good idea. But more importantly, perhaps, is these areas of loss are losing votes. The Electoral College is not being kind to these places that are losing big population, and they're losing power. So Chicago may lose 2 House seats. I don't know, maybe 3. New York City is losing at least 1, maybe 2. And they refer to this as population dispersion. It means everybody who's living in these dense central cities has moved just over the border to other places. Now they move just over the border because the taxes are easier, because the cost of housing is easier. The quality of life is better, but it is not like they're moving really far away. They're doing what they call dispersion. And I think dispersion is a thing that is going to stick around for a while. So just be aware that these numbers are real and mean something. Now, encouraging dispersion, and I'm saying it is happening. The latest census population, and this is out of New Geography, by the way, the latest census population estimates indicate the US population has dispersed even more rapidly during the pandemic. In other words, people are saying, I'm out of here. A principal reason is the adoption of remote work that made it possible for large parts of the economy to operate with less risk of infection. Now, that was just the infection, but the cost of living can't be ignored. So what happened is people are picking up and moving faster than they thought. This also made possible for many to obtain more living space inside and outside, where housing prices are more affordable. So right now, New York City has said, you got to come back. Chicago is doing the same thing. You got to come back. Washington, D.C. is saying, no, you can't live in other parts of the country. You've got to live here. They're having a harder time attracting people back because a lot of people are realizing by working there, they're losing money, not just maintaining the same thing. So my friends at Adobe, for example, got their jobs, then moved to inexpensive housing and are working out of their houses. A lot of people are doing that. It seems likely that remote and hybrid working will increase in the future, along with higher housing affordability related to the cost of living differences. It's going to continue to sustain dispersion. So if you can go to San Antonio, which I mentioned earlier, if you can go to Boise, Idaho, and have a nice job, if you can go to Tampa Bay or Orlando, Texas, Orlando, Florida, it just means not all of your money is going to your housing. That's one major reason why it's happening. Now, if you want to know where to go, if you want to evaluate locations you're considering, please visit us. And a telephone consultation is just very inexpensive as a way to get solid recommendations and numbers that are very recent on the locations you're considering going to. So I hope you'll give us a call at Dr. Demographics. We look forward to talking to you. Probably the fastest way is to call us at 800-849-0499 or see us at drdemographics.com. I'm suggesting if you're doing a telephone consult, please have your significant other, have your partners, have your relatives, because very few people are moving by themselves. They're moving in clusters. And by the way, this has exacerbated the amount of moving that's going on, because people are moving as a group. So if we can help you, please let us know. We'd be anxious to help give you peace of mind in picking the perfect place to put a practice.